Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our first module on the Neil Hill Academy. And we're going to talk a little bit about anatomy and muscle function. Now, in reality, we're not going to talk too much about anatomy because most of the anatomy of the body is laid out in quite a lot of depth within the module handbook. What we're really going to talk about is these key points here within this video. So we're going to talk about what causes movement from a perspective of, why do we need to create movement, I guess, is the sort of more appropriate way of putting that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the orientation of the body in space and why that's important. I'm going to talk a bit about the different types of movement there are. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about forces, moments, and types of loading, just so you can get an idea of the different basic principles of biomechanics. Talk a little bit about the practical biomechanics for bodybuilding, so how we can use this knowledge of forces, moments, and types of loading to our advantage, or how we can use these to make our lifting more efficient if we were looking at, say, maximum strength testing, so on and so forth. And then I'm going to jump into this, and it's something that I'm sort of keen to emphasise really is the biomechanics of a back squat, because I've seen a lot of coaches teach this really badly. I don't think back squatting is essential to develop a good physique, but I do think a back squat is important because, as an exercise, it's a big, heavy compound exercise. A lot of people seem to want to do it at the moment. And also, it is great for developing basically all of the lower leg muscles, as well as your postural control muscles as well. Creates a good platform for a lot of other lifts, especially if you're involved in performance sport. And I've got a few little useful links for you at the end as well. So let's crack on with the list. So what causes movement? And this might seem really obvious to some people, but we've got muscle and bones, which comprise our musculoskeletal system. And then we've got our nervous system, which obviously then provides the sort of electrochemical signals that transmit our thoughts, or sometimes not our thoughts if we're talking about unconscious action, to our muscles to create movement. And then obviously we need some energy to drive this process. So throughout the whole of this academy, we're going to talk about these things individually. So this one, we're going to focus more about the muscles and bones. We'll do a little bit about the nervous system. We'll do a hell of a lot on energy systems, because that's massively important, not just for creating movement, but also for obviously fat loss, optimal performance, so on and so forth. And obviously energy levels then impact on a myriad of other things like hormones and so forth. So we're going to look at it from that perspective there. So in terms of movement, the two movements that we're most familiar with really are concentric and eccentric movement. So concentric is just where a muscle shortens under load, and eccentric is where it lengthens under load. This is very basic stuff. Many of you guys, if you're PTs out there, will know this. Just refreshing the point here, because it does come in later on in terms of when we're assessing movement, we need to be able to assess in sometimes more complex joints how those muscles are moving, and to really think about it in order to get the best activation in the best positions that we can put our clients in, or ourselves in if we're interested in training ourselves. But, and this leads on to this, muscle activation does not always equal movement, okay? And when we're talking about that, we're talking fundamentally about isometric contractions, and that means that the joint does not move, muscles will be activating, but your agonists and your antagonists, so your muscles either side of a joint, will typically be working in opposition of each other. So if we think about this from doing a bicep curl, because it's just an easy example to use, if we have tricep activation whilst we're trying to contract our bicep, yes, we may create movement, but that movement is going to be somewhat restricted by the activation of our triceps pulling that opposite direction, okay? So when we talk about, on your first assignment, we're going to talk about a little bit about that, and I want you to really get into the nitty-gritty of looking at, what muscles cause what actions in what ways, what are the synergist muscle groups, what help, and what muscle groups actually hinder, because one of the adaptations that we'll talk about in the central nervous system module in terms of muscular or central nervous adaptations to resistance training is this idea that our bodies become more efficient and our antagonists don't fire as much, so they don't restrict joint movement as much. But this can also have other implications, for example, in terms of injury. So if we're thinking about sprinting, I'm a Liverpool fan, if any of you follow football, and we've had a lot of hamstring injuries recently. So, there's a lot of research that shows that your hamstrings contract eccentrically when you're running to actually help stabilize the knee joint. So sometimes we might want some different types of contraction. We need to think about those things and those movement patterns, especially if we're dealing with athletes that perform in very dynamic, very sporting environments. We need to think not just about developing muscle tissue, we need to think about muscle firing patterns and what ways best suit their type of movement. So that will come into your first assignment as well. We're going to evaluate that on for a muscle group of your choice. Okay, so why do we need to move? This might sound a little bit silly, but obviously the first one and the most obvious one is it's to overcome external loads. Okay, so we need to overcome external loads for a number of different reasons. So obviously the first one, from a survival perspective, so as a species, is to escape danger. Okay, we need to be able to move move around our environment, to be able to find food, to be able to find shelter, to be able to escape danger. And throughout the academy and the content, we'll talk a little bit about survival, because it may not seem relevant when we're talking about people who, we're living in a modern world where food is in abundance, and food is everywhere, and we have access to exercise and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, survival still drives a lot of our processes, especially when we're talking about fat loss and weight loss, especially when we're talking about in kind of the central nervous system and hormones and so on and so forth. Survival still governs and still dominates those things. So if we're creating a stress response comparable to something that would be, driven from survival, so an adrenaline response would be an example of that. That has implications for our body, not just in terms of energy output within the immediacy, but our long-term hormonal environment, which can impact on our fat loss. It can make fat loss harder. It can make it easier if we can manipulate it to our advantage. So like I say, if we can think about our bodies as a survival machine, it makes life a little bit easier to understand why our body sometimes appears to do weird things when we don't want them to. Obviously, we need to move to able to, this sounds a bit of a contradiction, to stabilize and protect the joints. Now, by this, what I mean is I'm not talking about stability in the sense that to stabilize a joint like you would think about keeping it in one place, limiting unwanted movement that could be damaging. I'm talking about this from a perspective of putting our bodies in a position to actually protect it. So if we're getting an external force, an external impact, say we're getting tackled in a sport like rugby, American football, or we're landing, we need to be able to absorb some of those loads and shock some of those loads and actually get our body in a position to protect ourselves. Even in resistance training, we need to be, some people will have a different postural position where they need to be in order to get the muscle activation to actually lift the weight, firstly, most effectively, so if we're talking about strength athletes, and secondly, to actually do it in a safe way, and that should be the primary sort of objective, is to lift safely and maximally as best we can, trying to marry those two sort of ideals. And sometimes they're not easy to marry. There's a reason that a lot of people maximally injure themselves doing max lifts, and it's because you are pushing those thresholds of secure body positioning and the sort of load that you're trying to shift. So another one is, obviously, for us, we're interested in bodybuilding. I guess that's how you first heard about Neil and why you enrolled on this course. So obviously that's going to be a big component of the things we learn. But it's also about other different things as well, to create adaptations that are going to improve our health and improve our quality of life. Now, by improving of health, there's a few things that we can look at with regards to that. Two things that are very closely related. Firstly, is looking at things like sarcopenia. Okay, so sarcopenia is muscle wasting, and it's typically age-related as well. So as we get older, our body's ability to turn over protein to preserve muscle is diminished. And therefore, resistance training can be a great way to help preserve, and actually has been shown in some studies to reverse those effects to an extent. Okay, and also then we've got osteoporosis, which is bone wasting, which happens a lot in the elderly, but particularly in women at the onset of menopause. Certain types of estrogen levels fall, bone turnover then isn't as healthy, and therefore they are prone to slips, trips and falls, because you've got your muscle wasting, which means you can't be stable, combined with more fragile joints, and therefore we have the sort of fractured hip syndrome that elderly people suffer, and this massively impacts on people's quality of life as well. And as coaches, when we first start out and we first start training people, we want people to have, better bodies, more muscle tissue, leaner physiques. But ultimately, you can open yourself up to a whole new marketplace if you can start to think about resistance training and fitness from more of a holistic viewpoint, from a viewpoint of, actually, this is a really important tool to actually improve people's quality of life in an aging population, okay? As a population, we're living longer. By actually improving people's quality of life, not only are you helping them as an individual, you're going to help society as a whole. They become less of a burden financially because they're not in and out of hospital on both themselves, or on healthcare providers. So these sort of things for me are massively important, not just because everybody wants to get massive and shredded, but also because if we can actually create movement in a healthy, dynamic way and in an appropriate way, so if we're talking about the appropriateness of movement and the functionality of a movement, if we can actually help strengthen elderly populations, to use the same point, in a way that's going to help them be more mobile, help them be more functional and target those muscle groups in a more effective way, then actually what we're doing is we're creating a better life for everybody, for them, their family, and obviously then if you get good at that, more business for you because you're opening up market opportunities. Next we're going to talk about types of movement, okay? So the first type of movement, which is the simplest one that everybody always understands, is flexion and extension. Simply put, flexion is typically to reduce the angle at a joint, and it's typically a bending motion, okay? So if we imagine, again, going back to the bicep example because it's easiest, if I'm going to flex my bicep, my hand is going to come closer to my shoulder. So my hand here is going to move up to my shoulder here. Okay. Extension again is to increase the joint angle. So if my hand was touching my shoulder, it's going to then open back out back to this position here. This position here, by the way, is called the anatomical position with the hands pointed outwards as well. Okay, and that kind of movement takes place in what's called the sagittal plane. Sometimes it's called the median plane, but generally, if you're reading scientific text, it will refer to it in the sagittal plane. So you just got to imagine you're looking on the body sort of side on, okay? So other things that happen in the sagittal plane primarily are plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. So plantar flexion is pointing the toes away from the shin. So this is quite plantar flexed here. You could say this person was in almost maximal plantar flexion because his toes are pointed right down. And dorsiflexion is moving the toes towards the shin, so upwards towards the body, so towards the dorsal, which is the dorsal, dorsal fin of a dolphin is the body. So if you think of it in that sense, moving the toes towards the body is that. In the module handbook, these two are actually the wrong way around. I've tried to correct it, but I made an error. I must have been half asleep when I wrote that first module. I guess sometimes when things are your bread and butter, you kind of forget. Sometimes it just, when you read over it, you don't realise the mistake. So I'll blame my editor for that one. But yeah, those two are the wrong way around in the module handbook. So this is the correct definition now. So then when we move on to our frontal or coronal plane, so imagine we're chopping the body in half this way. So the easiest way to remember this one is just like you're looking at the body head on. So any movement you can see in that plane there directly. If you imagine you could only see in 2D, not 3D. So basically we're looking at abduction, which is movement away from the midline of the body. Simple way to remember this is to abduct is to take someone away, okay? Or take something away. It's a bit of a morbid way to view it, but it helps it stick. And adduction is to move back towards the midline of the body. Okay, so abduction and adduction, typically when we're talking about the body, we talk about abduction of the arm, moving away from the body, adductions back towards the middle, and abduction of the hip, back in and out as well. There aren't too many joints that actually abduct and adduct. So there's not too many sort of too many joints you need to worry about in that sense there. The shoulder and the hip are obviously complex because you can have combinations of flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. They are complex joints. So when we think about movement, we need to really sort of analyze these things, and then once we understand the movement, we can then start to think about what muscles could be causing those movements as well. And also then, if someone is struggling with a certain lift, we can start to then target those focal points of those muscles that should be causing that movement, where the movement may break down, to actually then isolate and target those movements. I think this is something I'm going to segue away from a little bit. I don't like the idea of people saying that, functional or non-functional training. I mean, all training serves a function. So if you're doing a bicep curl, it's not seen as a functional movement. However, the function is that you're trying to grow bigger biceps. So what you're doing has a purpose. It has a function. And even when you talk about powerlifters or Olympic lifters or CrossFitters and they say, they're functionally training. Okay, well, even in those contexts, which I do agree with to an extent, doing a simple back flexion or extension task can actually improve your function, because you might have a weak point for, say, a deadlift or a snatch, by where your spinal erectors aren't very strong. So by performing those isolated movements, you're actually improving your function. So by default, every movement you perform, if it has a purpose, is functional. So I don't necessarily buy into that as a terminology. Isolation work and bodybuilding work is still highly functional by the very definition of the word function. Sorry, that's just a bit of a segue there, but that's just my thoughts on it as well. Feel free to disagree. And then we've got sort of rotations, I guess. So we have medial rotation, which is obviously the rotation of a segment of the body towards the midline of the body. And then lateral rotation is to move outward away from the midline of the body as well. And this leads into pronation and supination, which are more specific terms for the same thing, but relating to either the hand or the foot as well. Now, I know this is in the module handbook, and I've put this here to talk over it really, because I want to reiterate the point that if you're going to read papers on biomechanics, or it's something that massively interests you, you really need to get a grasp of these terms, because there's nothing worse than trying to read a paper and having to or a book and trying to have to flick backwards and forwards between these sort of key terminologies. Okay, so by doing your reading now and trying to absorb these little things, actually when it comes to your assignments or it comes to future learning, you're going to make life a lot easier for yourself by just absorbing these terms now, and it almost becomes automatic, like a little sort of secondary movement and body space awareness language. Okay, so now we're going to move on to forces. So with forces, what we're fundamentally looking at is it needs a few different things. It needs an object for the force to act upon, and it will cause this object to move if unopposed, and it causes a mass to change velocity. So if you think about pushing a ball, if you push a ball, you're creating a force which is going to move that ball to change from having no velocity, so at 0 meters per second, to say 5 meters per second if you were to push it or kick it really hard. You can also have a force that acts on an object that may be already moving. So if that ball was coming towards me at 5 meters per second, and then I stop the ball, then I've still caused the mass to change velocity. So a deceleration and acceleration can actually still be resultant of a force. Now, an important thing to look at is to look at the context of if unopposed. What I mean with regards to do that is to think of if I'm trying. So now we're going to move on to levers. Okay, so we're going to move from forces and also talk about how they then can kind of act through the different pivot points of our body or our joints, and how we can overcome these things. So a lever consists of 3 parts. So we've got a pivot or a fulcrum. Like I said, in the body that would be a joint, and in this thing here we've got a little blue thing here denoting a pivot. We've got a load. Typically what we're talking about here is a load is something that we want to overcome, so that would be an external force. And then we have a force which then we then use to move that load. Okay, so in the first class lever we can see that we've got a balanced position here. So think if we've got a seesaw and we've got 2 children of exactly the same weight sat opposite ends of the seesaw, we're going to be in a balanced position like that as well. Not one end is going to move up, not one end is going to go down. Now, if I increase the load, the red arrow, that means that I've got to then increase the force in order to balance that force or overcome it. Or alternatively, what I could do is, if we look at the thick black line, which is our lever, okay, or our lever arm, what we could do is we could move our green arrow further to the right, because the force that you can produce at a given pivot is equivalent to the force, which we've got in green, times the distance. So the further the distance away is from a fulcrum, the more force you can produce. Okay, so I think it was Galileo who said, give me a place to stand and I will move the earth. And basically what he was implying was that he could use the moon as a pivot to then create a very, 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 very long lever to then stand the end on, which would then move the earth. Okay, so bear that in mind, because that's really important when we talk about moments as well. And then we've got a second class lever here. So basically if you look there, the pivot is on the far left hand side, and the load is being applied internally to where the force is. Okay, so this would be, if we're trying to lift somebody up, if we stand directly underneath them, it's going to be harder. If we move further away towards where the green arrow is, or further away down the kind of lever arm, it's actually going to get easier as well, because obviously the further away from the pivot point we are, the more force we can apply. If the person we were trying to lift up then, who's the load, becomes stubborn, he could move further up the lever arm towards up, and it's going to get harder again. So we're always in this balance of the force and the distance it is from the pivot point as well. Okay, now unfortunately for us as humans, or as mammals in general, the third class lever is the one that's the most abundant lever in the body. And it's unfortunate, but it kind of has to be this way. If you think about how we're put together and how we move, basically there's a reason for this, and it may sound silly, but although it puts us at a larger mechanical disadvantage because our point of application is usually well, it's always pretty much closer to the pivot than the actual load, which puts us at a disadvantage. Basically what this means is that if you think in terms of angles, we only have to generate a very small amount of movement near the pivot to get a larger range of motion towards the end of the lever arm, okay? So this is actually, from one perspective, from a mechanical perspective, a disadvantage, but from a movement perspective, it's actually an advantage, because a relatively small contraction, if you think about how little your biceps shorten, okay, considered to how much movement you can get through an arm, actually this creates an advantage in the sense that a very small amount of movement and contraction and force can actually generate a long range of motion, okay? So that's why mechanically, although it's a disadvantage, it actually makes sense for us to do that, okay? And this is the one that's the most important in the body, and it's the one where we have the most interest in terms of how we structure our lifting and how we can manipulate our lifting to our advantage. So on the next slide, we're going to move on to moments, which again relates to the force time distance. So your moment, which is a measure in Newton meters, which, as it suggests, is the force times the distance from the fulcrum. Okay. So when we talk about moments and torque, and this is what we're talking about here, if we think about our third class lever, what we've got is we've got our body producing a force here from our biceps. So we've got our bicep tendon inserting here into our forearm. And we've got this producing a force at an angle, okay, against an external load, okay, which is the red arrow here. So the green arrow is the force of the bicep, and the red arrow is the load. And then our pivot point here would be the sort of our center of joint rotation, which is where obviously our humerus meets our sort of ulnar and radius in there. Okay, where the blue triangle is. So the amount of force that's has to be produced by the bicep to overcome this load is proportional to the actual load itself, so its mass, and also the distance that it lies from our little blue fulcrum here. So if you've ever watched, I'm not going to sound sexist, but it does happen, if you ever watch women carry shopping bags, they will generally carry the shopping bag looped, either put the bag in your hands and put them down by your side, which would be the way that men would do it typically. And what this does is actually, if you think about the action of gravity being through that red line, okay, if you put that hand below the pivot point so that the hand is by the side, gravity hasn't got a distance to act through. So if we think about that black line there as a distance from the pivot in relation to gravity, so if gravity is acting downwards, it's acting almost perpendicular at 90 degrees to gravity as well. If we put the hand below us, okay, there is no horizontal distance component in that. So although the weight is there, what we're actually carrying is just the true weight. And that's why if you had bags by your hand and then you then start to bring your arms up towards your front, okay, it starts to get heavier. And the simple reason of that is that your lever arm length from your pivot outwards away from your body in relation to the action of gravity is actually increasing. So the more you flex your arm, the more you bend your arm inwards, the actual harder it gets to move that weight, because the horizontal distance, and that's the important thing here, the horizontal distance from your pivot point to where the point of application is due to gravity is actually increasing, okay? Now, back to when ladies carry shopping bags, what they will tend to do is they will tend to hook the bags over their hands and put them up by the forearm. And the simple reason for that is they can keep their arms bent, so they can keep their arms contracted, okay? So the biceps are at 90 degrees, the bag would be looped around here, but actually the point of application of force is now closer to the pivot point here as well, okay? So there's actually less moment, okay, or less torque that is now being applied in this direction. So we can actually see from that perspective there, a very simple example, that we can actually carry a load in a way that makes it easier or harder to do so, okay? Now obviously with resistance training we want to make things a bit harder at times, but we may also want to make things easier at times as well. So I'm not suggesting like hooking a dumbbell over your arm here, but there are things you can do where you can actually change the position of your body to make a lift easier, okay? Or if we're not looking to make it easier, we can actually make it more efficient. So if we're talking about, we'll talk about this in the squat in a little bit more example, but if we're looking at point of application from a ground reaction force perspective, we want the bar to maintain over our midfoot because we want gravity to be pushing that bar straight through our body. We don't want us leaning forwards, we don't want us leaning backwards. And the more efficiently we can keep that bar on a straight line towards our midfoot, the easier it's going to be to lift, okay? Because you're not going to have to be fighting torques all over the place as your body starts to be pulled forwards and backwards. It means that any force that you're applying from the ground upwards can be applied in the direction that you intend it, and all the force is going to fight the action of the weight and gravity to then lift that bar up as well. So these things become very, very, very important. Okay, we can also use it in a few different examples here. Let me just click. Okay, so it should really be clear now as to why our muscles have to be stronger through mid-range. And the reason for that is simply because, it's not true of all muscles, but when we're talking about our main sort of flexor and extensors, it has to be strongest through the point at which we're at our weakest mechanically. Okay, so regardless of what position that is, joint position that is, the muscle will be strongest where the external moment and the lever length arm and the point of application is at its greatest as well. Okay, and you know, we need to consider this relationship with gravity because we can use it to our advantage or our disadvantage. So certain people will have certain lever length differences, so longer tibia, longer femur, longer torso, longer whatever muscle or bone, you want to say. They'll have different muscle insertions, and we can really use that to either optimize our maximal lifting by really assessing those movement patterns and really assessing where our mechanical advantages are. So working out how we can generate our own torque through the bar or through a weight the best we can. So looking at things like stance position and foot position when we're squatting, which we'll go on to in a minute. And we can also use it to our disadvantage if we so choose. So we can use it to our disadvantage by putting our body in an unfavourable position where we're maybe creating more stretch through a muscle before we start to activate it. So a simple one of this would be sitting down, almost kind of like if you were thinking in an inclined dumbbell press position for a bench press, but that starting position but for a bicep curl where the elbows are behind the body. Okay, this is creating a lot of stress through the bicep before we start to lift, and actually places the body at a mechanical disadvantage in the sense that it finds it harder to activate, because by changing our body's position we affect the length tension relationships of our muscle. Okay, so this is all relevant to squatting, you know, and we'll see that in a minute about how changing one body's segmental position can have impacts on the activation of muscles in another part of the body. Okay, so by doing that we can actually create a disadvantage that we may want. And why might we want a disadvantage? Well, if we've got an injury, we might want to put our body in a position where we can actually get the same muscle contraction but with less load. Okay, so we can use that to train around injuries. We can also use it for things like mechanical drop sets, by where you're stronger in a certain position, so therefore by shifting the position from a weaker point to a stronger point, you can almost do the equivalent of a drop set, but without having to change weight, which is an efficient way to do it, for example, if the gym's busy. So an example of this would be if your flat bench or your decline bench is strong, then when you've failed with that, if you've got an adjustable bench, you could then go to flat, slight incline again, and slight incline again until you reach failure. Okay? Or sorry, you would work the other way around. So you would start at the point where you're weakest, so you'd start with like a shoulder press, and then you could move the bench down and down and down and down and down to 30 degrees, 15 degrees, then to flat, and then to decline, until you actually playing on those mechanical disadvantages. So you can do a drop set using the same weight on the same muscle group by just changing the position in which you do it. Okay, hope that makes sense. But obviously for the most part we want to be able to use our mechanical advantages. And one way you can use this is to use gravity as our friend. Now, this is an important consideration because I think a lot of people get confused with this. Now, as our joint angle decreases, so as we flex our arm and the angle between our forearm and our upper arm decreases, okay, we're in a position of mechanical disadvantage because the lever length arm is lengthened. We've drilled that point home enough times now, I hope. But in certain positions, that might not be the case. So if I'm lying on my back, okay, and I do a bicep curl from there, because gravity is now acting in a different way. So I've got my arms by my side and I'm doing a bicep curl on my back. At the point where my arm is at its weakest mechanically, when I'm stood up, it's now at its strongest. Because if you think about that point of application, where is gravity acting? Gravity is now acting directly down through my hand, through my forearm, to my elbow, because I'm lying on my back. So imagine now you're lying on your back and your arms, your fists are now dumbbells in hand but pointing directly at the ceiling, okay? So what you've done by shifting your body's position is made it easier to go through in that same position, which is why the important consideration is the angle of the arm, but in relation to gravity. So it is the horizontal distance that matters, okay? So by changing the body's position, you can actually take an easy part of a lift, so when the biceps at full extension, so when your arms are straight, by lying on your back and then trying to do a bicep curl from there, you've actually made that into the hardest part of the movement because it's the point furthest away from your pivot point at your elbow. Okay, so how can we use that as our friend in gravity? Well, if we're looking at a rest pause set, for example, where I don't want to put the weight down, if I'm doing a dumbbell press, okay, and I keep my arms out wide, the load and tension is through my chest. If I then bring my hands together, so my hands come above my shoulders, basically the dumbbells then are above my shoulder joint. So there's less force acting through my shoulder, which is then being transferred to my pec. So if I want to rest pause with a heavy dumbbell set, I don't need to put the weights down. I can extend upwards and then bring my hands in a little bit. So those dumbbells are putting very little force directly. They're putting the weight through the shoulder, but because my arms aren't out in my pressing position, there's going to be less load through there. So for rest pause, it's a really, really obvious thing. It's the same with squatting. You can rest with a bar on your back squatting. Why? Because the bar is over your midfoot, your point, which is your point of application. There's no torque or no real torque acting on the body. Yes, it's a little bit tiring. Okay, I'm not suggesting there's no load there to control, but there's less load and enough that you should be able to get your gas back and then squeeze out those few more repetitions. Another way we can use it is by using time under tension, okay? So time under tension basically kills the momentum part. So when we're performing a movement, we've got momentum, so we've got the previous part of the movement carrying force into the next part of the movement is the simplest way I can try and describe it. Hope that makes sense. By removing that momentum, not to be confused with moments, related but not directly, by removing that acceleration, by removing that momentum, okay, you're now relying on the muscle to do the work because you haven't got the actions of, the initial contraction and that momentum carrying through, right? So by slowing things down, you can actually get more contraction at a lower weight. Again, this is really good for injuries. So if you've got knee problems or anything like that and you want to squat, you can still squat, but you just slow down that eccentric and concentric portion of the movement. Therefore, the muscles have to contract harder because there isn't any momentum or carryover from any position to the next. Okay? And then obviously there's isometrics. Now, isometrics, yes, the muscle's not moving, but isometrics are really important if you're going to step on stage or compete because simply it's conditioning, okay? A lot of what you do when you're posing a muscle is isometric contractions, okay? This is also a really effective way, I think, in some movements to get a full contraction. So particularly training calves, I find that doing isometric holds with calves is a really good way to actually activate the muscles fully that I don't just get from doing normal sort of movement patterns. It's also very, very beneficial for people who struggle with mind-muscle connection. So getting them to almost engage the muscle isometrically before engaging the full movement, full range of motion, okay? So particularly with things like rear delts and with your lats, by actually engaging your lats or engaging your rear delts before starting the full pulling movement, you're actually targeting that muscle group, and it enables clients or yourself, if you struggle, for example, to actually engage those things. And the first few sets I will always do, and Neil is a big fan of isometrics as well, first few sets I'll always do on back will be trying to really get that connection. And then once my back's firing, those neural pathways are open and everything's going well, then I can then use that to then carry over to my other heavier exercises, and I know I'm still going to get that contraction and I'm still going to switch those muscles on and get them working in the way that I'd like. Okay, so biomechanics of the back squat. So obviously back squatting, if we're doing it heavy at least, produces big loads at the ankle, knee, hip and spine. It requires mobility, inflection and extension. So if we think about, we've got to be able to bend our knees, we've got to be able to bend our ankle, we've got to be able to bend our hip. We've also got to think about our shoulders. If we can't get the bar into a favourable position on our back, we're going to struggle, and this can actually cause elbow pain. And I've seen this happen where people jump in too soon. So I'm not suggesting that you should spend hours doing mobility work, but there are other ways around it. So for example, if you struggle with mobility to squat to depth, you really should be doing things like kettlebell squats, where or goblet squats as they call them, where they're in front of you. You can do front squats. You can do all that stuff which will help you get those strengthen those muscles in the right direction before you move on to back squat. You've got to be able to move in an effective way to do it safely. And like I say, mobility is typically inflection and extension. When we look at those things, think of ourselves looking at ourselves side on, okay? So in order to perform a squat effectively, we need to have flexion extension at the hip. We need to obviously crease our hips as we go down. We need to have a little bit of flexion extension in the spine, but we want a more neutral position obviously there, so that's less important. And And then obviously the ankle as well. Ankle mobility is a big one for a lot of people. It's why weightlifters or powerlifters sometimes wear squatting shoes, because they've got a raised heel. So by having your heel raised or even stepping on a block, you'll see some people do in the gym. What that effectively does is it opens up your ankle joint so that when you squat down, it doesn't close up as easily. So it doesn't restrict your movement in that sense. And then the knee as well. So I'd advise before squatting, if you're going to coach it or do it yourself, is to really work and get at least a basic range of motion on those things. Again, there's loads of good sites out there that look at those sort of things as well. It doesn't take much to improve your mobility. It just takes a bit of effort and a proper progression of those lifts as well. Now, it also requires stability. Okay, now stability is going to be in all joints, so the frontal plane of motion should be restricted. So by that I mean, if we're looking front on at someone, there should be no real adverse movement in any direction. So that includes the butt shifting to one side. That's a really common mistake as well. So if you're watching someone squat and they're shifting their hips to one side, okay, that's probably because one leg is stronger than the other. Now, that's fine if they're going for a maximal lift, but ultimately, if we're trying to develop a balanced physique, their butt should go down right bang in the center of where their base of support is, okay, so between their feet. If it's not doing that, it suggests a weakness, and the more they shift the weight, the more they're going to load one side of their joint within their hip. That can cause hip problems on one side. It can cause shortening of muscles in the side that's being loaded and lengthening the others, which can cause all kinds of knock-on implications as well. The knee is a really, really important one, and I've seen this where coaches have videoed their clients squatting, okay, and they get so caught up on looking at squat depth and mobility, I guess, and get into depth that they forget about stability. When you see people's knees dipping in, that's a sign of weakness, okay? So that's a weakness through your hip abductors. So, we need to be able to create an environment where we can actually drive our knees outwards so that our knees stay in line over our ankle joints. If your knees are dipping inwards, the weight's too heavy and you've got weaknesses elsewhere, so you need to go away and work on those weaknesses, work at a lighter weight until a knee becomes stable, because that is a recipe for disaster. Okay, so then within that, that takes a lot of program. It takes a keen eye, and same with the head position, same with everything else. The head should be stable in a neutral position. The back should be in a neutral position. Some people like to overextend their back or arch their back because they find it actually activates the back. Again, that's specific. And the other thing that people will say, in terms of mobility, is that your knee should never track in front of your toes when you squat. That's absolute nonsense. Your squat mechanics will be dependent, like I was saying earlier, on the length of your tibia, the length of your femur, the length of your spine, where your joint insertions are. There's no correct way to squat, but as a general guideline, the points I've just made there about stability in the frontal plane and mobility in the other planes, as long as they're pain-free, are pretty steadfast. Everything else is open to interpretation. So we're going to talk about bar positioning as well. If you don't know what a low bar squat or a high bar squat is, you can just quite easily Google those, and there's plenty of instructions on those. So low bar squat, basically the bar is further down your back, so it's laying more across your rear delts. Okay, now this includes more involvement of the hip flexors when you squat and the extensors. It puts a lot of load on the spinal flexors. It gives you more of a folded up movement, and your extensors, your spinal extensors are always in play. Your high bar squat, there's more involvement with the knee extensors as well. So a high bar squat is more of a bodybuilding squat, and that's going to target your quads more. Okay, and there's a reason for that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So with a low bar squat, if you think about it, the bar's further down your back, so you almost have to start bending your hips forwards, okay? So you're bending from your hips to actually keep the bar over your base of support, which is like slap bang between your feet, okay? With a high bar squat, because it's already higher up your back, you don't need to come over as far. So when you're starting that movement, the movement already can be with the almost breaking with the knees before you break with the hips, whereas with a low bar squat, you're already breaking with your hips, and that's going to become more and more and more, okay? So with a low bar squat, you generally can squat heavier, okay? That's why a lot of powerlifters use it, but your range of motion is restricted because you're folding over more in that movement. With a high bar squat, generally you can squat a bit deeper. So if you think about Olympic lifters and the way they squat, okay, or bodybuilders and the way they squat, you can generally squat more because your spine remains more upright, but the load is a lot more on your quads. And yes, your glutes do get activated and so on and so forth, but it's a lot more focus on the knee extensors. And I'll explain to you why from a biomechanics perspective on the next in a second. And obviously, your stance width then affects the distance the load has to be moved. So if you stand wider, you're effectively making yourself shorter. So it's why, again, a lot of powerlifters will use a low bar squat and a wide stance. Okay, so you're actually increasing your glute recruitment. Standing wide is going to increase your glute and hamstring recruitment as well. However, it does put a lot of strain on your adductors and hamstrings, and it's not as focused on your quads. So it depends, again, the type of squat that you use depends on your goals, okay? So if you're squatting for powerlifting, you might want to go a bit wider. If you're squatting for bodybuilding, you probably go, typically the way to determine your stance width with anything, with a deadlift or a squat really, is to imagine yourself trying to jump explosively. So the position you put yourself in where you're strongest is typically where your stance width should be, okay? So why is there a difference? So it's to do with the point of application of load at the knee and hip. So ultimately, regardless of what we're doing, the bar must travel in a straight vertical line. So from the point where you're at your strongest, the longer the bar stays in a straight line, so the bar should move vertically. It shouldn't drift forwards or backwards of that vertical line. And it should be directly over your base of support where you can generate the most force. Like I said, high bar starts over the base, and the low bar is going to be slightly behind. Therefore, the low bar will often start by flexing the hips and high bar by flexing the knees. Now, this is not typical of all people. People have different mechanics, but this is what I would call a generalization. And this early hip flexion stretches the hamstrings, glutes, and activates them earlier in the range of motion, and this restricts the depth. Because you're flexing the hips first, if you just lean forward, you'll feel your hamstrings and your glutes activate, okay? And because they're activated earlier, they're going to stretch earlier and they're going to activate more, which means that your range of motion for most people will be restricted. And it actually places the back in a more folded over position. Whereas the high bar, your spine is more upright, there's less hip flexion and more load placed in the knee extensors. And this, obviously, the low bar, it affects the length-tension relationship of the muscle. So it restricts the range of motion, but there's greater muscle tension generated, so there's greater potential for force there as well. So if we look at the movement model, so we're going to bring this right the way back now to biomechanics, and this should explain it clearly. So if we look at the red, so that's our midfoot balance point here, and we've got a low bar position. If you look at the distance from the head where the bar is, what you can see here, and we've got the high bar position here, where the grey circle, which is the weight, is closer to the head. With the low bar, to keep that circle over the red line, we find that we have to fold over more. So you can see at the hip, there is more flexion at the hip. Okay, and if you then look at the moment arm, so the orange line between the red line, where the barbell is the force of application over the midfoot at the bottom, that's actually increased compared to the moment arm, which is the blue line, from the point of application of the barbell to the knee. Okay, so in the low bar squat, you can see there that actually the load is mostly going to be through the hamstring. It's going to recruit the glutes, okay, because that orange line relates to the moment that is going to be pushing on those sort of hip flexors and extensors, okay, and your hamstrings as well. And then we look at the red line here, okay, for the high bar squat. What we can see there is that the body is less folded over, okay. The knees, if you look, track more in front of the toes typically, okay, and then therefore the barbell from this red line and the blue line there, which is basically your quadricep moment, okay, is now extended. So there's more load on the quadricep and less load onto this side here, which is the moment arm between the hips and the bar, okay. So you've got your blue moment arm, which is the moment arm between the knee and the bar, and your orange moment arm, which is the moment arm between your hips and the bar. And what we're talking about moment arms, we're talking about rotational torques as well, okay? So the more torque that's being placed on a certain part of the body, the more load those parts of the body have to produce to overcome them, okay? So take a second to look at that. I got that from powerliftingtowin.com. I've drawn these graphs myself, but these are just better examples of them. Just makes more sense to just use people who've done things better than you. So that's why those two things are different as well, and that's why a high bar squat is more glute and hamstring dominant. There is quads involved, whereas a high bar squat is more quad dominant, less glute. Still glute and less glute, but then again, with a high bar squat, you can actually squat deeper, and the deeper you go, in a high bar squat, the more glute activation you're going to get as well. So that's why a high bar squat is preferred more for muscle building, because actually you can increase your range of motion, and once you get past this sort of 90 degrees sort of knee flexion position at the bottom of a squat, you're actually recruiting a hell of a lot of glutes into there as well. In terms of squat depth, there's a few different definitions of squat depth. Some people will say parallel. The powerlifting definition is the sort of crease of the hips below the line of the top of the knee. Basically, you need about 90 degrees of flexion in your knee to get full quad activation. Okay, any deeper than that, you're not going to get any more activation, but you might get some extra glute and some extra hamstring activation as well. So, if you can squat deeper, do. If you can't, don't stress about it, because at the end of the day, if you're using it as a quad exercise, then 90 degrees is enough. Parallel will be enough. Okay. So hopefully that's cleared that up, and now we've seen how we can look at forces and loads and actually see how that affects the way we move, and then we can look at those applications then to look at even the minutiae of how certain muscles work across certain joints in certain people, and this might mean why certain of your clients are getting pain, why some people appear to be stronger than others, even with relatively comparable mechanics, and it's to do with lifting efficiency as well. So to finish up this lecture, we're going to talk a bit about clinical biomechanics as well, and this is really important. This is part of my research here to do with ACL injuries, cruciate ligament ruptures, which is a big chunk of my project. And what we have here on the top left is one of my research colleagues, and she's got these little retroflective markers, and we have these special cameras around the room, which we then pick up these markers, and then on the bottom right image you see there, we've actually created a model. Okay, so you can see those markers are then picked up by the computer system. Everything else is blacked out, and then we draw these special models together. And what these models do is multiple different things. They can tell us the angles that each joints are in relation to each other. Okay, and then what we can do then is, if we look at that red line pointing up from the ground, that is our ground reaction force that we mentioned earlier as well. So if you think about those things in the floor as a glorified weighing scale, so it mentions not just measures vertical force, but also horizontal force, rotational forces, so on and so forth. Very, very advanced. And then what we can do is, if we know the force and we know the joint angles, we can then start to look at calculating moments. If we can calculate moments, we can calculate the forces in the joints, and then we can start to see how those forces are distributed through the body. Now, in the case of my study, it was looking at how ACL people adapted after their injury to actually either if they reduce load at the knee, if they increase load at the knee, and what sort of implications this would have for their long-term knee health. We can also use this with athletes. So if we're looking at athletes to get efficiency in their movement, we can sort of see maybe where they're distributing their loads, to make them better. Or if we're looking at injury prevention, we could look at maybe where, if we were looking at, say, say a javelin thrower, and they really plant that lead foot before they throw the javelin, we could look at where the loads were. So we could maybe design programs that can strengthen those muscles and actually help stabilize the muscles that they're using in those big, high impact sort of loads, and to design training programs for those people. In professional sports, people would use these biomechanics to identify screening. So if if you're looking at squatting, for example, you can actually quantify where these imbalances are. So we're talking about people shifting their hips when they squat or shifting their load. With these, you could have two platforms. You can visibly see that and quantify it, and then over time you can make those adjustments to know exactly where those load and those points of applications are to actually improve people's performance. So I think that's the end of the module now, as denoted by my blank white slide. So I hope you enjoyed that. Any questions you have about that, just drop me an email. It was a very brief overview. I didn't want to get too much into the biomechanics of it, because I know how challenging it can be, but hopefully you've taken some messages from this, which is that we now know why our body needs to produce force, how to overcome those external loads. I'd encourage you to do some extra reading about mechanical advantages. I didn't want to go too much into that because I could end up just getting lost in examples. Hopefully the back squat will show you a little bit about how you can think about where bar placement makes a difference, and if it can make a difference on your squat, it can make a difference on your deadlift, it can make a difference on your bench. And really one of the key kind of things that a good coach can be, if you want to go and be a strength and conditioning coach or a strength coach, is really identifying where people's strong points are and making those adjustments and trying those things as well. What works for one person won't work for others. And it's taken me a long time to sort of develop those skills. I'm actually better at sort of seeing people's movement dysfunction now from training people than I did actually from doing my PhD and directly, because I wasn't looking at it from that perspective, and I always had the tools available to me. But now you've got an understanding of those things, hopefully you can go away and apply some of those tools, so that you now know that just because, if someone's performing a movement and they can't feel muscle activation, there might be a very good movement for that. It might not be that, not a very good movement, a very good reason for that. It might not be because they're not performing the movement correctly. It just might be they're not performing that movement correctly for them as well. Okay? So yeah, like I say, hope you enjoyed, and we will be back soon with Module 2, and we'll start getting into the nitty-gritty of various other systems of the body. So we'll speak to you soon. Look after yourselves. Goodbye.